Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Marisol Dicion, and I am the Managing Director at Women of Influence Plus. Today's LinkedIn Live session is called Redefining the Meaning of Power in an Era of Uncertainty. Leadership is evolving. The old models rooted in control and hierarchy no longer meet the moment. What's emerging is a more grounded approach, collaborative, trust-based, and built on shared influence. Dr. Alaa Murabit has been helping to shape this shift for over a decade. A medical doctor, UN advisor, and global voice for inclusive leadership, Dr. Murabit brings deep clarity and real-world insight to how we lead, especially in uncertain times. Dr. Murabit, I will call you Alaa from this point forward. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Wonderful. Now, just one housekeeping note to our audience members, our valued audience members and Women of Influence Plus community. Please share your questions in the comments section, and we will try our very best to get to all of them during today's session. Okay, Alaa, we're going to kick things off. Now, when you launched the Voice of Libyan Women when you were 21, what was your definition of leadership then, and how has that changed for you?
Oh, it's such a great question. I don't think I had a definition for leadership. I actually think I spent a lot less time thinking about things in the theoretical or in the when I was 21. And I always say I never would have been able to do VLW. I would have never created it now with the same level of confidence and like almost naivete as I did then, because I was so sure that it was almost a civic responsibility that we were all going to do something to create the country we wanted. We had just gone through it. Well, it was in the midst of a revolution when I founded the organization. And it was my firm belief that if we didn't create organizations and opportunities for equity, for access, for equitable healthcare, equitable economic opportunity, et cetera, no one was going to create it for us. And it was particularly stark to me because women were so involved and kind of so leaned on in the actual conflict phase, right? When it came to transporting medicine, making sure clothes were transported to the front lines, making sure people were transported to the front lines, making sure people were fed. Like there was this fabric of care that women provided. And the second things became politically determining, suddenly women were excluded from the conversations. Conversations started being held at 10 p.m. They started being held in other countries. It became exclusive by design. And that was what really, I think, struck me. So it wasn't that I don't think at 21 I had a definition for leadership. At 21, I had a definition for accountability and responsibility. And I think that's what drove me to create the organization. Over the years, I've now realized a lot of that was anchored in my understanding of what it means to be a leader in a community. But I don't think that's whatever drove it. And I don't think I had a definition for it at the time.
You know, that actually brings me to a question that I didn't plan for, but has sprung to mind. It's that naivete that you talked about when you're 21. And I often refer to my own naivete back when I was in my early 20s as ignorance on fire.
Oh, yeah.
I had this desire to like go out there and make a change. Do you find that sustaining that, refining that ignorance on fire, that naivete over the last few years is something that you have been able to do successfully, that you've been mindful of? Because sometimes that tends to fade away, right?
Yeah.
As you continue along your journey.
I think it's a gift. I honestly do. I think that the level of confidence and the positive assumption. So when I started the organization, and I've now been in this space for 15, 16 years. And when I started the organization, I was in my final year of medical school. And I genuinely believed without a shadow of a doubt that if I could get people to understand, just to know the data, everything would change. I was like, I'm going to do this for 2 to 3 years. Then I'm going to go back to practicing medicine. Because what people need is just the data. And then they'll realize gender equity is a good thing. And they'll realize women's leadership and equitable access and healthcare is security. And it turns out, no, it turns out that it's not just telling people and data. And so for me, at that point, it was I don't think I would have done this work had I known more about global development and had I known more about power dynamics and had I known more about, I don't think I would have ever. I was just so sure that it was because people didn't know, not because people were, willfully excluding women. And so I think it's actually one of the greatest gifts in it. And I always continue to call myself an activist because I still feel it. I think it's been dulled And it's been refined. And to your, we were talking earlier about diplomatic language. I've learned to say the same thing in a way that might be received by different audiences in the right way. And I think that's made it more sophisticated and helpful. But to be fully transparent, I definitely think yeah, I think it's something I miss a lot because, now I'll always measure, I'll say like, oh, but historically that didn't work. Or, we would have to talk to so and so. I start making a bit more of I game plan it a little bit more. When I was 21, I woke up and I was like, we're doing this and it's happening. And so, yeah, no, I think ignorance on fire can be a very, very good thing.
I think we found our next LinkedIn Live session. Let's go further down into your career, Ala. So you've worked in fragile, high pressure systems. What have those environments taught you about how power, as you alluded to a little earlier, actually functions?
Power is such an interesting. So one thing I will say is I never walked into this work with an understanding initially that I was asking people to give up power. In my opinion, I was asking people for common sense things. And it wasn't until about a year and a half into the work, um, one of my relatives in Libya said, "This is great for you." And I said, "Okay, well," he's like, "This is great that you're doing this work, and you have some of these women are interested, some of these families." I said, "Well, why isn't your daughter there?" And he's like, "Oh, no, 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 no. This is good for you, but not for my daughter." No. And I asked why. I kind of really dug into we had a very deep conversation. It started with, well, because God would frown upon it. It went to, this is not, this is ayib, which in Arabic means like this is socially unacceptable. And it straddled that line between kind of religiously prohibited and socially unacceptable. And it made me realize a few things. I had always been cognizant of social dynamics, social power dynamics. I have 10 brothers and sisters. It is impossible not to be cognizant of social dynamics in that way. And I always knew how to kind of negotiate an alliance build in my own home. If I wanted something from my mom, I went to my youngest brother or my oldest sister. If I wanted something from my dad, people came to me. We had those kind of clear lines. But what I didn't realize was silent power brokers or kind of invisible power brokers. And for me, faith was the biggest one. And I didn't realize just how much they shaped because I walked in assuming everybody had the same understanding of women in faith that I did. And I didn't appreciate the complete domination, both organization and disorganization, which I know sounds paradoxical, of organized religious institutions and their influence on women and girls and societies. And for me, that was the biggest lesson in power I've ever had. And in the sense that as a women's rights organization, we didn't have inherent credibility or power with the community when compared to faith institutions. And so, how much of a compromise do you make to partner with faith institutions to validate religious, documents that you're going to use in advocacy? Or how much do you lean into leveraging other platforms and people's credibility and power to sustain and to amplify your own? All of that was taught to me, I would say, by that relationship. What is socially acceptable? What is religiously in a country like Libya? And that's only been amplified since, because then you layer it with so many other dynamics of power. So you have your organized religious institutions. Of course, you have your media and your and your communication and that ability to be literate in different forms of media that I think is a form of power. And of course, underlying all of that, you have your social and your racial and your different hierarchical powers. And so um, every role I have been in since has given me another lens into it. But what it has reaffirmed for me is that we all own spheres of power. I am going to be the most powerful person walking into particular rooms. They will listen to me in a way they won't listen to some guy named David or, a Kathy or an Amira or whoever, right? I will be the person who feels most credible, most tangible, and most legitimate to them and who has most shared experiences. Oh, sorry. Okay, go to Nana. Sorry, everyone. This is my son. We were just talking about being in the middle of this. This is our generation.
Yes.
But it's okay. Go. Sorry, one second.
That's okay. While we wait for Dr. Murabit to come back to us, this is the real reality of life, of working and raising a family. We do have a few questions here, so please continue to share your questions in the comments section, and we'll get to them as soon as Dr. Murabit can rejoin us for this discussion. It's so nice to see so many of you here with us today. Oh, hi, Alaa.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I think he's sticking around.
No worries.
We've been talking a little bit about scissor generations, and it's pretty early here on the West Coast, so he's joining in.
Well, we're glad to have a special guest appearance for sure. Dr. Mir,
Go right ahead.
you were discussing the different forms of power and how they take shape and manifest in our day to day, and that actually leans really well into my question about power over versus power with. So, in your view, what would you say the core difference between these two types of power, if we were to sort them out this way, are, and how does that difference shape how the way leaders show up?
Well, it's interesting. I think some people are forced to look at power within kind of a power with structure. I think it's very different if you are, kind of capable of, from a very young age, feeling as though you're able to have power over. It's an interesting, and I think you exercise different skills and you create different capabilities and strengths. I had a very good friend of mine, a mentor actually, when I was very young, tell me, listen, there are 4 things you need to keep in mind when you walk into a room that people will always see, regardless of what, letters you have behind your name, what degrees on the wall, what experiences you've had. And that is that you're young. He said, you're lucky, that one you'll grow out of. He said, you're a woman, you are Muslim, and you are very clearly not, you are Arab, a minority. And I thought that was pretty interesting in the sense that he pointed to 4 things that had forced me over years. Some were more than others, and I'm sure many in the audience can feel the gendered one in particular, to be more diplomatic, to be more alliance building, to negotiate differently. And in the conversation, I thought it was so interesting that he saw those as weaknesses, because to me, those were ways that had strengthened my ability to collaborate and to do things differently. He had never had to build that muscle. He had always been able to kind of walk into a room and command space. He had been a general in the military. He had came from, kind of a Midwest white background in the United States, had a name that felt very familiar to people. And so he was able to have power and own it in a different way than I could. I could never have walked in with the same assumption of legitimacy in many spaces and been able to get away with it. I needed to come in building and power sharing. So I think that to me was kind of an interesting way to first learn, okay, I can't walk in and steamroll as much as I want to. And believe me, there are times when I really want to. Whoa. He loved that. He's like, I've seen you steamroll, Mom. What are you talking about? But that's so that's kind of where the power with approach, I think, comes from. It's a recognition that, I grew up where if I did disagree with people, if I did have, I still had to live with them. I negotiate with siblings, but hey, buddy, you can definitely stay, but you have to be quiet, okay? Okay. But Mama, okay. Sing. I understand you want to sing, but if you want to sing, you can go sing outside. Okay? I want to sing here. Okay, no singing here. But the challenge of knowing that you have to then still work with those people, you have to still live with them when it comes to things like siblings, has shaped so much of how I determine engaging. I will say, it's so interesting to have this conversation right now, given what's going on in the world, because as much as I firmly believe that over the past 15 years, there's been an increased recognition that we do need to be building power in a different way, I don't think that's validated by what we're seeing in the world today. I think, if anything, we're seeing such a return to traditional forms of dominant power.
Yeah.
And I think we should then ask ourselves, and I ask myself this every day, I'm having some of the same debates I had when I was 21. It feels like, who is it, Sisyphus or whatever, pushing the boulder up the hill and the boulder coming back and getting you. But what have we then done in our movement, in our work? What should we be doing differently? What have we not done that has made it so challenging for people to see the benefit of collaborative power, of care as power? I wonder every day, what could I have done differently these past 15 years? Because the world we're looking at right now is not one that feels like it's heard that message. So
I think that's an appropriate time, Ala, just to discuss that point that you've made. So to our audience members who are listening, who truly are anchored or trying to root deeper into the power with narrative. So that's shared power, shared influence, moving away from leadership that looks more hierarchical, something that's more traditionally something that we've been exposed to and have been conditioned to accept as the standard. What words of advice do you have? How do you navigate a system that seems to be splitting at its seams in terms of how leadership should and does show up?
I think it's pretty interesting. That's such an interesting question to me because I think the challenge of it is right now in the world today, you're going to be told what leadership should and could look like. And I think it's actually some of these secondary spaces, for lack of a better way to say it, where you're going to see leadership be relitigated and redebated. It's not your more formalized institutions. It's not the ones that have a lot to lose, either financially or in other ways, by kind of shaking the table. So then the question becomes, how in our spaces are we modeling power with behavior that other people can learn from and see?
Mm-hmm.
The and I'll take the development space writ large, since I know that's kind of top of mind for a lot of people as a lot of the conversations are happening there. But if you look at the development space, or even if you look at the economic opportunity and investment space, we have spoken for decades about the underinvestment in women and girls. Decades. I mean, and it doesn't matter what area you're in. You could be in, strictly commercial investments, or you could be in development and global aid. And we're talking about a fundamentally different amount that goes to women and girls and goes to really investing in them. And that's regardless, despite the research, despite the amount of evidence, despite the amount that investment level has been finite. And it's followed similar patterns to more traditional forms of power. And we within our own community almost not necessarily adhere to it, but we definitely respect the rules of power and traditional power. And I think the question is, how are we modeling something different? How are we showing something different? How are we saying, how do we share power? How do we engage differently? How do we leverage each other's spheres of power? I don't need to be the go-to person in every room if I know you're the go-to person in one room. How do I work with you? How do we create strategies that actually see communities as they are and as they live experiences, rather than how we would like to define them because of our company or our government objectives, right? So there is a question of what our ownership is. And I will say that is one of the things that I think has been true since I founded VLW. I almost always, and I credit my parents with this, I almost always will try to find what I can solve in something if I don't like it. I will not spend as much. And sorry, can you hear? I'm seeing people in the chat say they can't. Can everybody hear?
Can everyone hear? Like checking? We'll share a recording as well, so you can continue, Ala, and we'll be sure to share the recording, which I'm sure the sound will be great. It's good on our end.
But I will say it's easy, I find it, especially in moments like this moment, to find all the things I don't like, or that I think are concerning, or that I'm upset about. It's much more difficult when someone asks, okay, what can you do about it? What can you actually do about it? It makes you focus in a really compelling way, because suddenly you're like, I can't fix, global policy. I can't fix other people's, actions. I can't fix a political, but then what can you fix? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And what can you do? And all of us within our own space can do something. It can be, are we platforming other voices that are not often heard? Are we leveraging our resources, our network, our credibility, our space to amplify others whose voices are not heard in this moment? Are we standing ground for our values and not allowing ourselves and our beliefs to be minimized and diminished? I think we're accountable for that. I don't expect us all to be accountable for everything, but depending on where you are and what space you really own, I think it's that ability to say, okay, I'm going to stand up for myself and others, and I'm going to create the space where I might not be the loudest voice in the room, but I'm leveraging what I do have to make sure that other people are here. So I would say my biggest question for power with is it's easy to say when everyone is positive, and when there's DEI marches, and when there's it's very hard to do when when the pool gets smaller. Everyone starts wanting to be the big fish. And in those moments, I think is the real test. So what do we do in those moments? Do we make sure that we're still creating space? Do we try to shift systems and power? Or do we adhere to a system that we think is being defined for us?
Absolutely. Now, a big part of what we should do, obviously, is tied to action, but sometimes what we should do is listen. I think that's a big part of power with leadership is listening, which can sound passive, but it's often where real leadership begins. So, in your experience, Ala, at working with different organizations and across different industries and different audiences, what does listening actually involve? Listening with the intent to make those changes, listening with the intent to make strategic plans about what best action, an organization, yourself, or a group should take.
It's such a good question. And so many people close to me would argue it's my weakest link, including myself. I tend to, no, and to be super transparent. I think one way where where we can all really help, I think, in terms of action or in terms is recognizing what our own strengths are. And I know for myself, I will walk in and I will have assumptions made, positive or negative, but I will have made assumptions. And I have to really park myself and say, you don't know everything about this situation. And it's why it's helpful when I walk into a situation where I don't have as much technical background because I'm forced to listen better. But if I'm walking into a conversation where I have technical background, they're talking about healthcare or they're talking about women's age, I'm like, wait a second, I already know the solution. And I really have to check myself. So it's an excellent question. I will say it has taken me, I will say there's two things. One is listening to really listen, not to respond. And I have to remind myself as I'm listening, especially if people are bringing up points that feel challenging to my own, because I start building up a debate in my brain. Um, and the second is giving people the benefit of context, both theirs and your own. And when I was growing up, one of my siblings used to say, talk faster or say less. That's how you got heard in a family of 11 kids. And I think it was hard to unlearn that, because then going into negotiations and global diplomacy, and you have to really give people space to build context. And a lot of people do that through building relationship. And for somebody who is looking for the answer in a conversation, sometimes that's not there. It's just genuinely relationship building and recognizing that you're somebody who can give and take. So I will say it is one of the most challenging things. I still think even people who tell me they're very good listeners, I'm always like, well, I don't, but it's a lesson. It's a daily exercise. And the last thing I'll say about listening is so much communication happens non-verbally, so much communication. And I think that is where I am strongest. That's my strong suit. Sometimes people are saying one thing and they are telling you a fundamentally different thing. And I can pick up on that, I think, in part because of my own background, in part because, I come from a culture to some degrees where people don't love to say no. They'll say inshallah or they'll say yes. And you have to read into what they actually mean by that based on how they're behaving. And so I do think those nonverbal cues become particularly important, especially if you're doing cross-cultural work.
Absolutely. You spoke earlier about spaces and making space. So, what makes a space feel open, in your opinion, where people are comfortable bringing forward ideas, of course, but also having the, I guess, psychological safety, the emotional safety to bring up questions that might seem out of scope or out of the box, and even challenges that others may not see, but they feel very obvious to the person who wants to voice it, but might
Yeah.
feel timid to.
So psychological safety is such an interesting term for me because I don't know that it is. I'll answer this from my own lived experience and perspective. I've never felt inherently psychologically safe, if that makes sense. I have felt that what I had to say was more valuable than the space I was in, and was more critical to me and to my, kind of legitimacy and my values than any space I was in. And that's been the uniform thought. I think psychological safety, when you are talking about, and I think it depends. So I'm again speaking, I think for many of us, especially if you are trying to take on social norms and power dynamics and cultural norms that are inherently embedded in community and society or in the space that you work, psychological safety to me feels like, the boundaries by which you can say that in an acceptable way, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
Mhm.
And I think that usually, and this is one of the top rules I have for negotiation, never negotiate something you're not willing to lose. But I think usually to speak up and to say, listen, I feel very uncomfortable with this, or I demand this changes. You need to be prepared to lose that space, that power, that credibility, that platform. I don't think that it inherently means that you're going to be safe there. And I think you need to do it anyways. And so maybe it's, I love the concept of psychological safety, but I think if you're really challenging norms and if you're really challenging systems, um, I think there should be a baseline expectation. And in building your own strategy for engagement, there should be an assumption that not everyone is going to agree with you, especially when you're asking the difficult questions, because we all exist in systems where, power dynamics are what they are because they're incentivized by reward. And so if you're going against those dynamics, if you're going against some of those reward structures, you are inherently threatening somebody else's space and somebody
Mhm.
else's incentives and somebody else's power and legitimacy and social capital. And so I would say do it in a very strategic way, a politically astute way, but I can't think of a single instance where I felt psychological safety or where I felt sure when I stood up for something. Probably the exact opposite. Um, so
I think I think that's the answer a lot of folks need to hear, is that when you are building the courage to say something that might not land, no matter how smoothly you plan for it to land, is to brace yourself for the unexpected and perhaps even the worst. But what I'm hearing is continue to cultivate that courage and to speak your truth, but do so strategically so it can be heard.
100%. So my husband and I have this thing where when I feel I can get very anxious about outcomes, as one could imagine. And so he has this thing with me where he does, okay, what's worst case scenario? What's best case scenario? It'll land somewhere in the middle. It might land completely in the worst, but at least I've now assessed that. I now am walking in fully aware. I won't be surprised, right? And I always, sometimes something will happen, and I'll tell my husband I'm shocked but not surprised, because we've mapped it out. There was a worst case scenario. I walked right through it. I knew exactly what I was going to do, and best case scenario, which is usually where I try to park my head. But we're human, and so when things start to unravel, it's good to have some optimism, but it's also good to be very, very realistic. And so that it is one of the things, as courage is a muscle, I think. I really do. I believe that everybody is inherently courageous. You give people something they care about enough, and they will come out, in full bear mode. And so I think first finding what you genuinely care about and are passionate enough about, what you think is your mission in life. And whichever role you play in that, whether it's through your company, your school, your community, your faith community, your family, whatever it might be, really owning that, and honing it, and recognizing, okay, what's the best case scenario in terms of what I can do in my life in this space? What's the worst case scenario? And then making every decision after that kind of fall with a bit of, not necessarily hindsight, but leveraging your past experiences to really give you some strong foresight on it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that advice, Alaa. I'm looking at our clock and we have 1 minute left, so I'd like to squeeze one more question in, if that's okay. So as we look ahead, what do you think the next era of leadership will require? Not just structurally, but internally. What will this require of ourselves as we look ahead?
I think a couple of things. I think care. I think there's a couple of things, but I would start with, I don't know if anybody else had this experience, but when we were growing up, one of my grade school teachers, who I admire without reserve, said, the stories you tell yourself becomes the voice in your head about what you're capable of what you can do, of who you are and what you can be. And I think that and I say this, I'm going to speak specifically about the gender equity space and women's leadership. I think for so long, we've told ourselves that we have to defend why we're here, right? And that we have to prove why we should be here. And we are anchoring it in data, and we're trying to do cool infographics. And I think we need to tell ourselves different stories. I think we need to tell ourselves stories about why current forms of leadership that have excluded representative voices are failed leadership. I think we need to be much more comfortable being belligerent's the wrong word, but unapologetic about the fact that that we have better solutions and own that a little bit more. I think we need to be really anchoring ourselves in care as leadership and resilience as leadership. And because like, the zero sum, mutual assured destruction. I mean, literally the name tells you that the way we're going is not going to be very effective for all of us in the long term. And so, and the last thing I'll say is there is a hierarchy in negotiation. When things are being negotiated, whoever gets to sit at the table gets to determine when to walk away, when they've gotten enough of what they want to walk away. And so I think we will continue to fail. And I will use the word fail here, unless we have a more representative seat at the table. And that is on us. So for women's rights organizations, for women's economic opportunity and power collaboratives, we need to be saying who are the most underheard voices and underserved voices. Because if they're not at the table, you leave the table too soon and the rights roll back. So how are we making sure that we're holding ourselves accountable for inclusivity in our own community? It's one thing to say we want inclusivity and access writ large. It's another to actually model that behavior. So if I would say any one thing, I would say care, humility, accountability. I think those all shape the way that we show up and the way that we create power.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Murabit, that brings us to our time for today. We could probably talk for another hour or so, and next time we'll work in a surprise performance by your son for sure.
Oh, don't worry. He'll work it in for himself.
Absolutely.
He's still on the ignorance is fire phase of life. So don't worry. He's like, this is a camera, a stage. I got this.
I was looking for some inspiration for Ignorance on Fire, and there you go. You ask and you receive, right? Thank you
Thank you so much.
Of course. And thank you to our Women of Influence Plus community. We will see you back again in a couple of weeks. Be sure to tune in and stay tuned on our page for details. Take care, everyone.
Thanks all.